The room was perfectly still, save for the steady, rhythmic pulse of the cooling fan. It was a sound Mark knew by heart, a low-frequency hum that signaled everything was running exactly as intended. He sat in the center of the workspace, the glow from the monitor washing over his desk in soft blue waves. This machine was the result of months of research and $3,000 of investment. Every component had been seated with surgical precision. The Ryzen 9000 rig sat encased in glass and steel, a monument to performance that occupied the entire corner of the room. He leaned back, listening to the fan blades slice through the air, a sound of pure mechanical efficiency. There was a profound satisfaction in the quiet order of the space. The cables were routed with obsessive care, the airflow was optimized to the millimeter, and the temperature sensors remained locked in the green. He watched the BIOS screen, where the system architecture displayed its readiness. The rhythm of the fan remained constant, but the air began to shift. It started as a faint, metallic sharpness, barely noticeable against the filtered atmosphere of the room. Mark paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He inhaled deeply, searching for the source. The smell was unmistakable now. Ozone. It cut through the cool air like a jagged blade, acrid and biting. It was the scent of electricity pushed beyond its threshold, a warning sign that bypassed the digital readouts on his display. He stood up, his chair scraping against the floor, and leaned closer to the chassis. The hum of the fan seemed to change pitch, a subtle, strained vibration that rattled the glass side panel. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he hovered near the exhaust vents. The heat radiating from the metal was not the steady warmth of operation. It was a dry, searing intensity that made him pull back instinctively. Every instinct he possessed as an engineer screamed that something inside the casing was failing. The scent of ozone grew heavier, filling the space. Mark turned his eyes back to the monitor, desperate for a diagnostic readout. The BIOS screen, which had been crisp and static seconds ago, was now a chaotic mess of flickering pixels. The interface shifted, bleeding into a sickly, distorted hue that pulsed with an irregular, nauseating rhythm. Text that should have been sharp and white now smeared across the display like wet ink on glass. He leaned in, his face inches from the panel, trying to parse the garbled data. The screen seemed to stutter, frames dropping and re-rendering in jagged, unnatural bursts. It was not just a software glitch. The signal itself was being corrupted at the source. He blinked, trying to clear his vision, but the distortion intensified, turning the familiar blue and gray menus into a wash of neon green and bruised purple. Every time the screen refreshed, the colors shifted further away from reality. He reached out to touch the monitor frame, his fingers tracing the edge as he searched for a reset signal, but the display remained unresponsive to his input. The system was trapped in a loop of visual decay. He felt the weight of his $3,000 investment slipping away, the high-end hardware failing to maintain even the most basic graphical output. The screen was no longer a tool. It was a warning, a flickering, distorted mirror of a machine that had lost its mind. Mark shifted his focus to the hardware monitor utility pinned in the corner of the display. The voltage readings were no longer stable. They danced, fluctuating with a frantic, rhythmic intensity that defied the system's idle state. He watched the V-core numbers climb, the digits ticking upward in increments that should have triggered an immediate thermal shutdown. The software attempted a correction, the fan speed ramping up to a high-pitched whine, but the voltage continued to surge. It pushed past the safe operating limits, the numbers glowing in a harsh, warning crimson. Mark tapped the keyboard, trying to force a lower power state, but the system ignored the command. The telemetry graph flattened into a solid block of red, a digital representation of a circuit drowning in raw current. He watched the peak values hit the ceiling of the sensor's range. It was a runaway process, a surge that no firmware could throttle back. The red zone was not just a warning anymore. It was the final state before total collapse. Mark pulled his hand back from the keyboard, his pulse hammering against his ribs. The monitor was a static wall of crimson data, but the real threat was the silence of the room. It had been replaced by a low, electrical hum that seemed to vibrate through the desk surface. He leaned forward, his palm hovering inches from the side panel of the computer. The metal was radiating a sharp, unnatural heat. This was not the warmth of a hard-working processor. It was the searing intensity of a circuit pushed to the brink of annihilation. He looked at the power button, a small, recessed circle of plastic that felt like the only gateway to salvation. His fingers twitched. He knew that one press could cut the current and save the silicon, or it could trigger a final, catastrophic spike. The air grew thick. He reached out, his index finger trembling, closing the final gap. He was a fraction of a millimeter away, poised on the edge. The air in the room felt ionized, thick enough to taste. Mark kept his finger locked in place, his muscles rigid as he prepared to depress the switch. Inside the chassis, the capacitors were screaming in silence, their dielectric layers straining under the relentless, uncontrolled voltage. A faint, high-frequency oscillation began to emanate from the motherboard, a sound like a dying insect. The monitor screen flickered once, the image distorting into a chaotic mosaic of green and purple artifacts before freezing entirely. The system had reached its absolute physical limit. Every trace on the circuit board was glowing with invisible internal heat. Then, the inevitable occurred. A sharp, violent pop echoed from within the metal casing, sounding like a small caliber gunshot. It was a dry, percussive snap that cut through the room with absolute finality. The vibration traveled through the desk, rattling the mouse and the keyboard. The internal light of the power button died instantly, plunging the machine into a dead, unresponsive state. The hum vanished, replaced by a sudden, hollow silence. Mark remained frozen, his fingers still hovering in the space where the switch had been, the echo of the destruction still ringing in his ears. A thin, gray wisp of smoke curled upward from the seam of the side panel, twisting into the stagnant air. It was acrid, carrying the unmistakable, biting scent of scorched plastic and incinerated silicon. Mark watched the trail of vapor rise, his eyes wide and unblinking. The machine sat motionless, a heavy, silent monolith on his desk. He leaned in, his breath hitching as the smoke thickened, drifting toward his face. It was not just a malfunction. It was the final, undeniable signature of a dead system. He reached out, his palm hovering near the metal, and felt a lingering, oppressive heat radiating through the paint. The fan had stopped spinning, leaving the room in a silence so profound it felt heavy. He looked at the monitor, still dark, and then back at the wisps of smoke. The reality of the $3,000 loss settled into his chest like lead. He did not move. He did not blink. He simply stared at the source of the ruin, watching the last remnants of his high-performance rig dissipate into the air. The smell triggered a sudden, frantic reflex. Mark snapped out of his trance, his hands darting toward the back of the chassis. His fingers brushed against the rough metal, his palms slick with a cold, nervous sweat. He reached for the thick power cable, but his hands were shaking so violently that he missed the grip twice. He cursed, his voice raspy and thin in the quiet room, and lunged again. He locked his fingers around the stubborn plastic connector and pulled. The cable resisted, held fast by the tight socket, but he jerked his arm back with a desperate, sharp motion. The plug snapped free, clattering against the wall. He didn't stop there. He grabbed the heavy, dead weight of the machine and hauled it from the corner of his workspace to the center of the desk. He slammed it down, his chest heaving, his heart hammering against his ribs. He stood there for a second, his knuckles white, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The machine was disconnected, but the heat still radiated from the casing, a lingering reminder. He wiped his palms on his legs, his eyes locked on the side panel. Mark reached for his screwdriver, his hands still vibrating from the adrenaline of the shutdown. He placed the tip into the first screw head, but his grip slipped. He took a steadying breath, pressed down hard, and twisted. The metal groaned under the pressure, a sharp, metallic protest that echoed against the desk. He moved to the next screw, his movements deliberate and slow. Every turn of the driver felt like a violation of the machine he had spent weeks assembling. He felt the resistance of the threads, the friction of the metal against metal, and the growing dread of what he would find once the barrier was removed. He paused, his screwdriver hovering, listening to the faint, settling ticks of cooling components inside the case. The air felt thin, charged with the lingering ozone. He applied more torque, his knuckles turning pale as the screw finally gave way with a sharp, crisp click. He repeated the process for the remaining fasteners, his focus narrowing to the task of exposing the damage. With all screws removed, he placed his palms against the side panel. He pushed, the metal sliding back with a long, grating screech that set his teeth on edge. The panel fell away, revealing the dark, silent heart of the machine. Mark leaned over the open chassis, his breath hitching as the stagnant air hit his face. The interior was a tomb of silent, lifeless components. He reached for his desk lamp, angling the beam directly into the heart of the machine. The light caught the motherboard, and the reality of the failure became impossible to ignore. The VRM area, once a clean, intricate landscape of capacitors and heat sinks, was now a blackened, twisted mess. A jagged, dark stain spread across the board like a spreading bruise, the resin bubbling and hardening into a jagged crust. He traced the scorched traces with his thumb, feeling the rough, abrasive texture of the melted silicon. It was not just a simple short. The heat had been intense enough to warp the very foundation of the board. The smell of burnt electronics was thick here, clinging to the plastic and metal. He stared at the charred signature of the surge, the copper pathways beneath the surface visible through the blistering. Every component in that sector was fused. A graveyard of expensive, high-performance hardware rendered useless in a single, violent pulse. He pulled his hand back, his fingers stained with a fine gray soot, and looked at the ruin again. The precision of the engineering had been obliterated, leaving behind only the hollow, blackened skeleton of his investment. Mark wiped the soot from his thumb onto his desk, his movements sharp and erratic. He reached for his phone, the screen glowing with a harsh, artificial light that felt intrusive in the dim room. He tapped the icon for the hardware enthusiast forum, his heart hammering against his ribs. He searched for his specific motherboard model, his fingers hovering over the glass. For a second, the search bar was empty, a blank void that mirrored his own confusion. He pressed enter. The results loaded in a sudden, cascading wave. He scrolled down, his eyes darting across titles that were identical to his own experience. Photos flooded the screen, each one a mirror of the charred, blackened silicon sitting on his desk. He saw users from Tokyo, Berlin, and New York. The sheer volume of reports was staggering. He stopped scrolling, his breath catching as he realized the scope of the collapse. This was not a localized accident. It was a digital plague. Thousands of voices were screaming into the void. He leaned back, the phone slipping slightly as the reality of a global crisis settled. Mark tapped the screen, filtering the results by date and firmware version. The pattern emerged with terrifying clarity. Every report shared a common denominator. The latest BIOS updates released by ASRock and ASUS. He opened a technical analysis thread, his eyes scanning the raw data logs provided by a power user. The logs showed the exact moment of the surge. The firmware, designed to squeeze out marginal performance gains, had disabled the safety limits on voltage regulation. It was an intentional push, a reckless gamble to top the benchmark charts. Mark watched the graphs on his phone, the voltage lines spiking into the red zone. The updates were not just buggy, they were a death sentence for the hardware. He cross-referenced the release dates with his own system failure. ASRock and ASUS had unleashed a digital trigger, a silent command that forced the VRMs to draw power far beyond their physical capacity. The surge was not a fluke of manufacturing, but a calculated systemic failure of design. Mark set the phone aside and turned his full attention back to the silent, broken machine. He reached out, his thumb hovering over the VRM area where the smell of ozone still lingered. He pressed his skin against the blackened surface, feeling the rough, abrasive texture of the burnt silicon. It was cold now, a stark contrast to the heat that had destroyed it. He leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing as he traced the path of the scorched traces with his fingertip. The damage was not random. It followed the precise lines of the power delivery circuits, a map of the surge that had ripped through the board. He grabbed a small magnifying glass from his desk, the lens catching the light as he hovered it over the ruins. Under the glass, the microscopic pathways looked like jagged lightning bolts etched into the green laminate. He followed them from the capacitors to the CPU socket, seeing the same pattern repeated across the entire board. It was a failure of design, not just a single faulty component. He moved his thumb along the charred edge. This was not a fluke of assembly line luck. It was a systemic collapse of quality control. a deliberate oversight that had left the hardware defenseless. He sat back, his thumbs stained with black soot. Mark pulled the digital receipt back onto his monitor. $3,000. The number sat on the screen, bright and clinical, mocking the heap of blackened silicon sitting on his desk. He looked from the invoice to the motherboard, then back again. The disparity between the cost and the result made his jaw tighten. He had traded his savings for a machine that was now nothing more than a paperweight. The betrayal felt personal, a direct violation of the trust he had placed in the brand names printed on the box. He picked up the motherboard, feeling its weight, and turned it over in his hands. It was heavy, dense with components that were supposed to last for years, not days. He set it back down with a sharp clack against the wood. The silence of the room returned, but it felt heavier now, charged with the realization that his investment had been sacrificed for a marketing race he never asked to join. He stared at the dark monitor, seeing his own reflection in the glass. He was not just a customer, he was a casualty of a corporate strategy. The anger began to settle, cooling into a hard, focused resolve. Mark leaned back, his chair creaking in the quiet room. He looked at the blackened board, not as a broken object, but as a symptom of a much larger rot. The industry had been obsessed with the race for benchmarks, pushing silicon to the absolute edge of a cliff and watching it fall. He traced the path of the failed circuits again, realizing that the voltage surge was not a malfunction, but a design choice. They had sacrificed stability for raw, unoptimized speed. It was a calculated gamble, and he had been the one to pay the price. He pushed the motherboard toward the edge of the desk, the metal scraping against the wood with a harsh, grating sound. The entire market was built on this foundation of fragility, where performance numbers were prioritized over the longevity of the hardware itself. He stared at the dark screen, his reflection looking back with a grim, hollow expression. The industry had forgotten the fundamental rule of engineering. First, do no harm. They had chosen to ignore that rule, and the result was a graveyard of silicon spread across thousands of desks globally. The realization hung in the air, cold and absolute. Mark reached for his keyboard, the plastic keys cool under his fingertips. He pulled the device closer, the cable dragging slightly across the desk. His hands were steady now, the initial shock replaced by a sharp, biting clarity. He opened the forum thread, the white text on the screen illuminating his face. He began to type. Each keystroke was deliberate, a rhythmic clatter that filled the silence of the room. He described the pop, the smoke, and the blackened traces on the motherboard. He did not hold back. He read the posts scrolling past him, a relentless stream of identical failures from users across the globe. Every word he added to the thread felt like a brick in a wall of resistance. He paused for a second, reading a comment from a user in another country who had lost their entire workstation to the same firmware update. He nodded, his jaw set, and returned to the keys. He was no longer just a victim of a bad build. He was a voice in a growing chorus of the betrayed. He typed out his final assessment, documenting the systemic failure with cold, clinical precision. He hit the enter key, the sound echoing like a gavel. His message was live. He watched the screen, waiting for the first reply, his resolve hardening with every passing second. Mark sat back, the glow of the monitor fading as he stepped away from the keyboard. The silence returned to the room, but it felt heavier now. He looked down at the ruined motherboard, the charred traces still visible under the desk lamp. It was a stark, physical manifestation of a broken promise. The industry had been in a frantic race for higher benchmark scores, pushing silicon to the absolute edge of its thermal and electrical limits. They had treated the hardware not as a reliable tool, but as a disposable stepping stone toward a higher number on a graph. He picked up the board, feeling the weight of the dead components in his hands. It was clear now that the hardware was the first casualty in this reckless pursuit of performance. Every failed chip, every melted connector, and every system crash was a direct result of prioritizing marketing metrics over stable engineering. He set the board down, the metal hitting the desk with a dull final thud. The race had been won by no one, leaving only a trail of scorched silicon and frustrated users in its wake. He realized that the pursuit of speed had come at the cost of the very foundation of his craft. The hardware was gone, and the industry had lost its way. Mark reached out and pressed the power button once more, a final, desperate attempt to revive the machine. Nothing happened. The fans remained still. The lights stayed dark. The monitor sat before him, a vast, obsidian void that swallowed the dim light. He leaned forward, his face inches from the glass. He saw himself reflected in the dark surface, his features distorted and pale. The screen was no longer a window into his work or his games. It was a mirror, reflecting the consequences of a hollow design philosophy. He traced the outline of his own silhouette on the glass, his finger leaving a faint smudge on the cold, unresponsive surface. The reality of the situation settled in. The industry had built a house of cards on a foundation of unstable voltage. He looked past his own reflection, deep into the darkness of the screen, searching for a sign of life that would never return. The black mirror held his gaze, offering no answers, only the stark, silent evidence of a promise broken. Mark reached up and clicked the desk lamp off. The last sliver of light vanished, leaving the room in absolute, suffocating shadow. He sat perfectly still, the hum of the cooling fan now a distant memory. In the void, the technical details of the failure, the charred silicon, the voltage spikes, the broken promises of performance faded into a single, sharp realization. The industry had sprinted toward a finish line that did not exist, trampling the core principles of their craft in the process. He exhaled slowly, the sound thin and lonely in the dark. It was a simple, ancient mandate that had been discarded for the sake of a benchmark score. First, do no harm. He realized that no amount of speed could justify the destruction of the tools he relied upon. The silence was no longer empty. It was a heavy, final judgment on a design philosophy that had prioritized vanity over integrity. He remained in the dark, waiting for nothing, knowing that the lesson had been learned at the cost of everything he had built. The rule remained, etched into the wreckage of his machine, waiting for a generation of engineers to finally remember it.